Call on Government Order of the Day number 5.
Game Council Bill, first reading.
The Honourable Peter Dunn.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Game Animal Council Bill be read the first time, and so I propose to refer the bill to the Local Government and Environment Committee. Mr Speaker, this bill delivers on the Government's 2008 Confidence and Supply Agreement with United Future to proceed with the establishment of a Big Game Hunting Council as part of a national wild game management strategy with a view to it becoming a statutory authority. And that provision had in turn grown out of United Future's 2005 agreement with the previous Labour-led government, which led to the establishment of the Game Animal Panel. After receiving over 4,000 submissions and hearing from a wide range of groups, individuals and organisations, the panel, chaired ably by the Honourable Margaret Austin, proposed amongst its recommendations the establishment of a statutory organisation to coordinate and foster management of recreational, guided and commercial hunting. So in many senses, this bill arises directly from the work of the Game Animal Panel, and I want to acknowledge this afternoon the work of Margaret Austin and her team. Now, during the last Parliament, the panel's work was taken a step further through the work of the Game Animal Council Establishment Committee, chaired by Gary Ockman, whose contribution I would also like to acknowledge this afternoon. The Establishment Committee conducted a further round of public consultations, and the upshot was this bill, introduced shortly before Parliament was dissolved for last year's election. So this bill is a culmination of a deliberate, thorough and considered process under both governments over the last 6 years, involving all the key stakeholders, and it is therefore with a real sense of pride that I bring it before the House today. The bill establishes a Game Animal Council, including specifying its make-up and functions. The purpose of the Game Animal Council is to improve the management of game animals, namely deer, tahr, chamois and wild pigs, including the improvement of opportunities to hunt those animals, while also providing advice to the Minister of Conservation on issues affecting the hunting sector. Secondary objectives for the Council include providing information and education to the hunting sector, reducing conflict within the sector, the promotion of safety initiatives including firearms safety, education and training, raising awareness and advocating for the views of the hunting sector, and conducting research into game animals and their management. The bill creates powers for the Minister of Conservation to manage what will be known as herds of special interests to hunters for recreational hunting outcomes, and allows for those powers to be delegated to the Council. A herd of special interest to hunters would be a game animal herd of a particular species or subspecies in specific locations that was considered to have high value to hunters, either because of the hunting experience and the accessibility of the animals, or the quality and the significance of the trophy. The bill provides the Minister with the ability to designate a herd to receive such a status based on the recommendations of the Council, along with input from DOC and other stakeholders. Upon a herd being designated as a herd of special interest, the Minister would in turn delegate to the Council specific management functions to be carried out under a herd management plan. The Director-General of Conservation, on recommendation from the Council, will have the ability to appoint warranted enforcement officers, similar but more limited in function to fish and game rangers. The enforcement officer's role will be to ensure compliance with the conditions of herd management plans and to prevent other illegal actions, including the liberation, conveying and the capturing of game animals. Mr Speaker, a localised example of the herd of special interest model already exists through the work of the Fiordland Wapiti Foundation. In the past 6 years alone, the Foundation has removed nearly 5,500 predominantly red deer from Fiordland, and that has been paid for and managed by recreational hunters and constitutes a classic win-win situation. Conservation values are being enhanced by the reduced number of deer, while hunters enjoy a wapiti herd with far greater genetic integrity and trophy value than it had before. Members of the Foundation have further contributed to conservation by laying up to 70 kilometres of pest control lines and funding the reopening of the Blue Duck Hatchery in Te Anau. And last December, Mr Speaker, the Foundation finally achieved formal recommendation of their efforts with the signing of a management agreement with the Department of Conservation. Now, the Fiordland Wapiti Foundation did all this from scratch and in the face of much scepticism. That's a great achievement on their part, and I congratulate them heartily for it. What the Game Animal Council will do is provide hunters with the legislative and organisational framework to be able to achieve similar outcomes in other parts of the country. Funding for the council will come primarily through a levy on the export of game trophies, supplemented by a small Crown contribution of $50,000 per annum. Provisions also exist in the legislation for other forms of self-funding to be explored in the future. It should be noted that the establishment of the council will not in any way alter the current way in which will not in any way alter current levels of free access for hunting opportunities provided to recreational hunters. The council will have a minimum of 9 and no more than 11 appointed members, and those who are appointed to the council will have knowledge and experience reflective of the diversity within the hunting sector and the game animal industries. And the members will be selected after a public nomination process. Both public and organisations with an interest will be able to submit nominations to the Minister. Mr. Speaker, I must emphasise, though, that this bill does not dilute existing powers to manage wild animals for the purpose of protecting conservation values. Herds of special interest to hunters must be managed consistent with statutory management strategies, plans and policies relating to conservation. But by allowing outdoor recreationists a greater stake in the management of their recreational resource, I believe, like the work of the Fiordland Wapiti Foundation, the Game Animal Council will achieve huge gains for both recreation and conservation. New Zealand's backcountry is a special place. However, it would not be half as special if people were not inspired to go and use it. And for many New Zealanders, their connection with our outdoor heritage is a major part of what it means to be a Kiwi. But the New Zealand backcountry is not, as some may wish it to be, an exhibition in a museum, nice to look at, but never to be touched, just another picture on the wall. It is a place steeped in history, rewarding of adventure and offering a lifetime of enjoyment. And so in some small way, I hope that this legislation and the organisation that it will create will uphold and enhance those values for the enjoyment of generations to come. And it's therefore with a huge degree of pleasure and pride that I commend this bill to the House this afternoon.
The question is that the motion be agreed
Mr.
to.
Speaker.
Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The real reason behind why this bill finds its way to the House today in the form that it does is contained in the very first words of the explanatory note on the front page. The Game Animal Council bill delivers on the government's confidence and supply agreement with the United Future Party. Now, what else did we discover today in the House does that confidence and supply agreement deliver to the National-led government? Asset sales. That is exactly why we find ourselves today debating the Game Animal Council bill and the recommendations it has in its current form. Because the government knows that it needs the votes of Mr Dunn and Mr Banks, because that's it. That's what's between asset sales, selling off the assets built up by past generations, selling off to supposed mum and dad investors who already own those assets. It's the vote of Mr Dunn. It's the vote of Mr Dunn, and if he's really going to represent the people of Ohio in this House, he should be listening to them and saying that asset sales are the wrong thing to do for New Zealand, and whatever benefits there might be to causes that Mr Dunn is interested in, such as around the hunting of game animals, it's not worth it, Mr Dunn. It's not worth it to sell off the legacy of past generations, the things that will generate income for future generations.
Point of order, Dr Cam Calder.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. Look, I realise the debate does range widely in this time of the debate, but we're talking about asset sales to the exclusion of everything else. It's hardly the subject of the Game Animal Council.
Order. I'm the judge of that, and the member has brought it back to the subject, but with a couple of minutes gone, I'm sure he'll now focus on 8 minutes ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Indeed I will, but it's important to note that in the explanatory note Dr Calder, of the Game Animal Council Bill, that's how it starts. It starts talking about the confidence and supply agreement, and the main reason that party over there wants that confidence and supply agreement is to pass their agenda of selling off this country's future, and on this side of the House we will be opposing that. This bill, Mr Speaker, comes to this House in a form that has a great deal of concern for the Labour Party. And it's important nowadays, Mr Speaker, because the regulatory impact statements for bills don't come to us as members of Parliament in the same way they used to make reference to the regulatory impact statement about this bill. Because it's a regulatory impact statement that makes absolutely clear that while there may well be issues to be resolved in how we have communication, cooperation and participation in the game animal area, this regulatory impact statement tells us that this is not the way to do it. It actually says, this is the Treasury and the Department of Conservation, this is what they say in the regulatory impact statement: given the Game Animal Council's proposed functions, the Council does not need to be a body corporate and require separate legislation. A Ministerial Advisory Committee under the Wild Animal Control Act would be a more appropriate structure. So why are we establishing a whole new structure here, a whole new council that actually sets up competing interests here, two organisations, the Department of Conservation and this body, in terms of the management of wild animals? Why would we do that when the Department of Conservation and the Treasury, the government's two key advisors in this matter, are saying it doesn't make sense, it's not necessary, there is another way? Well, that's right, Mr Little, there must be something else in it, and that brings us right back to asset sales. But if we go on, Mr Speaker, this government on the other side of the House tells us from time and time again they're all about efficiency, they're all about making best use of the resources. Well, let's look at what the regulatory impact statement has to say about that. Introducing separate legislation to create a Game Animal Council would have the highest costs in regulatory time and resources. The highest costs in regulatory time and resources. Well, so much for the efficiency of government, so much for making the cutbacks. Those officials at Foreign Affairs or Te Puni Kōkiri, they can be damned as long as the vote's there for asset sales. It doesn't matter that this is the most expensive option that's available in this area. As long as it delivers that vote of Mr Dunn for asset sales, that's fine. The regulatory impact statement, Mr Speaker, goes on to say, establishing the Game Animal Council under Section 5 of the Wild Animal Control Act would have the least cost in regulatory time and resources. While this would be the simplest and most cost-effective way to establish a Game Animal Council, it would allow the Minister of Conservation to disestablish the Council at any time. And that's the excuse given for why they're not going to take that option. Well, Mr Speaker, this bill will make it to the Select Committee. But what we want to say is that when it gets to the Select Committee, we want those other options considered. Yes, we want to see there to be more cooperation, more collaboration, more participation by those in the hunting community. But let's look at all the options. Let's look at an option that actually doesn't create confusion, doesn't create two bodies that are involved, and actually makes sure that we have the protection of our conservation values and allowing the hunting of game animals. And the Labour Party wants to make clear we respect the long traditions of the hunting of game animals in New Zealand. New Zealanders do enjoy this. They do actually help control animal numbers and protect biodiversity. But let's not set up a situation, a regulatory framework that's going to create confusion, that's going to lead to outcomes that might diminish some of that conservation area. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's pointed out that the Council could actually effectively, if they chose to under the proposed law, halt 1080 operations for possums or rats or stoats if they thought game animals were going to be at risk. The balance of how you make decisions about that is something that we believe the Department of Conservation has the key role in. By all means, let's have an advisory committee. Let's have some kind of structure or process that's going to help this happen. But let's not do it in a way that undermines the conservation values that we all hold dear in New Zealand. So we understand, Mr Speaker, that this is an area where there does need to be further work done. This is something that we want to make sure that all members of the House are able to participate in, and we will vote for the bill to go to the Select Committee for that reason. But I want to make absolutely clear in this House, Mr Speaker, that we have grave concerns that this structure is not only expensive, potentially unnecessary, possibly damaging to our conservation values, but it is also a straight-out sop to the United Future Party and Mr Dunn to ensure his vote for sales of state assets. We need to be absolutely 100% clear in this House that that's what this bill does. And in a first reading, Mr Speaker, I know that we are obliged to talk about the bill, and I have done that in some depth. But it is a matter of serious concern to this side of the House that this bill finds its way to this House today on the back of the sale of assets built up by past generations of New Zealand, on the back of sale of assets into the worst possible state of the global economy, with the worst possible price, which Mr English doesn't even know, he's guessing at it, the worst possible price could be gained from New Zealand for those assets. It makes no economic sense, it makes no social sense, but Mr Dunn is voting for it on the basis of the support for this bill to establish the Game Animal Council. Mr Speaker, we will take seriously in our contributions during the Select Committee process to look at the other options that might be available for the management and participation of interested groups in the management of game animals, but we do so knowing that this bill potentially creates a situation where the Department of Conservation will not be able to fulfil their role in the way that New Zealanders would expect in terms of protecting conservation values. We do see a place for the hunting of game animals in New Zealand, but we do not believe that setting up a body like this in competition effectively with the Department of Conservation is a good thing. We would like to see some form of committee or expanded committee created. We will listen to the submissions in the Select Committee process, and we will ensure that New Zealanders conservation values are protected while hunting continues to take place.
Call Todd McLeay.
Mr Speaker, thank you. It gives me great pleasure to stand and speak on the Game Animal Council bill. And can I say the last speech from the opposition was a load of puffery and posturing, but very good to hear at the end that they are likely to vote for this piece of legislation. What great confusion there is on the other side of the House, but at least they're showing that in some things they're consistent, and that's opposing absolutely everything. A great disservice was done to Mr Dunn, Mr Speaker. Mr Dunn started on this journey along with hunters and recreational enjoyers of the outdoors in New Zealand some years ago. In fact, I think Mr Dunn, first discussions were held under another government when Labour were on this side of the House. Can I say to you on behalf of hunters in New Zealand to recognise your commitment and hard work that you have put in to making sure that they have a seat around the table and have a voice around the table, and I think that recognition certainly is there. Mr Speaker, the reason it gives me pleasure to stand and speak on this bill is I want to declare an interest. I'm a member of the National Deerstalkers Association in New Zealand, and whenever I have an opportunity, I enjoy going out and hunting. And there's the interesting thing, Mr Speaker. Already we get opposition members calling that into question. If you live in a city, you probably don't understand fully what this piece of legislation is about. But in provincial New Zealand, parts of the country where we hold all of the seats, this is very important. All over New Zealand, hundreds of thousands of recreational huntsmen and others enjoy going out and spending time in the wild. And one of the larger complaints that I have had, or concerns I've had in the 4 years I've been a Member of Parliament for Rotorua, an area where we have fantastic hunting, by the way, Mr Speaker, has been that there isn't enough recognition of the recreational side of this activity, that whilst hunters come together in groups and are responsible and care as much about the environment and the management of these species as anybody else does, that they don't have an equal say or the same amount of say as they should. And so the very important thing here is that this recognises, everyday New Zealanders recognises that they are in pursuit of their leisure activities, and allows them to come to the table and have greater involvement, not control, but involvement in decision-making in some of the areas that affect them. Can I say to the members of the opposition and to the last speaker that I can confirm, Mr Speaker, that as a species, Mr Robinson is not covered by the scope of this bill, so he can now relax. I want to recognise a couple of people, particularly in the work that they've done. Tim McCarthy, who's the National President of New Zealand.
Order. I think that comment was unnecessary, and ask the member to withdraw it.
I withdraw, Mr Speaker. And I'll carry on without debate. Can I say, Mr Speaker, that I want to recognise Tim McCarthy, a National President of the NZDA, for his work. I certainly want to recognise Alec MacGyver, who's from Rotorua, who's the immediate past President of NZDA, who put a huge amount of work into this. Gary Ottman, who has also spent many, many years out getting people from the recreational community together in one thought and one voice on the way that we should move forward. I want to make a very special mention of somebody that emails me a lot, and I'm sure other members a lot. Honest Dave from Sarah Shooters in Rotorua, passing comment about him. But again, Mr Speaker, what I want to say is that very clearly this legislation is about recognising the rights and obligations of everyday New Zealanders in pursuit of their leisure activities. I commend the Minister of Conservation for equally working hard over the last couple of years to deliver what I believe is a very important and very good piece of legislation to this House. And can I say that I look forward to it going to committee, passing through the committee stages quickly, coming back to this House and entering into law, because many people on all sides of this House actually support this legislation for reasons other than those pretended at by members of the opposition. Kia ora, thank you.
The Honourable Shane Jones.
Tēnā koe. Sir, the preceding speaker identified himself as a member of the deer stalking community. The term stalk seems suitably apposite, based on the quality of that contribution and that gratuitous insult hurled at our colleague from this side of the House, who was pointing out, sir, that there are a myriad of interests whenever you deal with the conservation estate and wildlife management, and every single one of those stakeholders is entitled to not only bring their views forward but to amplify their views, which is why, sir, I look forward to this bill and I support this bill going to the Select Committee. I want to acknowledge the presence of members of the hunting and recreational community who have worked tirelessly to bring a group probably more disparate than the 72 tribes I was working with when I was the chairman of the Fisheries Commission. But I would say to them, sir, and I'd say to the Minister, that I do feel as this bill wings its way through the Select Committee and committee stages, sir, I look forward to seeing an inclusion that whatever committee finally survives the travails of parliamentary debate, that we find space to appoint, or at least to have the criteria guiding the Minister's appointments to this board, draw upon the expertise, the relevance and the capacity of the tangata whenua to add something to this large wildlife management question. And I'd like to put that, sir, to the Minister and also to members of that community, that who knows to what extent we will support this in its final form. But if you want it, sir, to gain a higher level of acquiescence and enjoyment amongst the larger tribes, such as Tūwharetoa and dare I say Tūhoe, then be proactive in that sense. So there are concerns about this bill. Let's just deal on one concern at the moment. You can create these advisory boards and these committees, etc., and give them whatever statutory status may be required as a consequence of a deal between the major party and Mr Dunn's party. But at the end of the day, sir, what will be the level of obligation upon the Minister either to delegate down to this specialist body to take any notice what this specialist body might say? And I think, sir, those are some of the reasons why members on this side of the House are right to be a bit sort of leery, sir, as to whether or not things will actually change. Because unless there's a positive duty on the Minister of the day or the Director General or their regional staff to pass on meaningful powers or take on board sensible recommendations, it can actually turn into a talking shop, and a great deal of hot air, a great deal of time, energy, possibly money will be expended, but it may not actually make it into the statutory processes for the management of this resource. Now, sir, there is a debate between the deep ecologists, represented by the Green Party, and those others of us who have environmental awareness but possibly live more with a pragmatic view of life. I certainly fit into the latter, sir. It seems to me, sir, that right. The deep ecologist's view is that wildlife ought not to be managed but wiped out. Now, sir, that view is not consistent with my conception of how trophies, how wildlife hunting, how improved wildlife management can contribute to regional development, how in a host of different areas around Aotearoa, sir, what's needed is an expansion of the type of economic activities that are capable of generating jobs and turning into a platform for export dollars. Now, sir, no one in this House is perhaps as well informed. In fact, sir, I believe you are peerless in this particular respect of understanding the capacity of wildlife hunting, better wildlife management, and its ability to contribute to regional economies. And sir, you're so persuasive on this matter, you had Calvin Davis, Ricky Barker and myself go out into the wilderness and demonstrate that not only are we capable of shooting mallard ducks, I shouldn't have said that, or ringtail pheasants, as has been my want in the far-flung areas, unfortunately poorly represented by Hone Harawira in the absence of Calvin Davis. And so we tend not to shoot the swans up there because they are sitting targets until they start to munch too many of the flounders upon the seabed and foreshore, which hopefully my tribe is rapidly regaining. But that's another matter, sir. So I would like, sir, that the records show that, without me sort of indicating what will be the final shape and form of our party's status and stand on this piece of legislation after it's been in the Select Committee, your powers of persuasion, sir, moved us in that direction up in the Buhai beyond Taihape. And amongst other things, sir, cell phones didn't work there. And in addition to that, probably the most intelligent creature I saw up there, sir, was the dog that was dispatched to find the deer that was shot but ran into the bush. Now, sir, far be it for me to say who shot that deer. Now, far be it for me to say that. So I think it could have been a national person and it was Bandy, but that's another matter. That's another matter, sir. So, sir, there are some aspects that we will not be supporting, I can tell you right now, to do with this bill, and it does, sir, lie between the debate as to whether or not exclusively it should remain the role of DOC to manage this resource, or ought this to be seen as something akin to possums, i.e. the chamois and the various other types of deer, to be eradicated. So that view is reflective of deep ecology, and I fear it represents zero growth, something I've got absolutely no time or support for. So the notion that there should be a game, trophy, levy, we should be actually able to charge a fee once these magnificent animals are hunted, etc., turn it into revenue, is beyond cavil. That, sir, I don't think is going to attract a great deal of negativity. But then I can see also, sir, some people opposing it for fear that it represents an incentive not to reduce numbers, but actually to maintain them for that profit motive. But so all these things can come out in the Select Committee. We can have those who genuinely feel that DOC is being denuded of powers. There are others who feel that at long last the empire known as DOC, which is often a feeling reflected on the maraes of Māoridom, they're going to have to listen and be statutorily required to take on board the views of this part of the wider New Zealand recreational community. And let those views, sir, come forward in a credible and manageable process. But I would say, sir, that myself personally feel a lot more reassured, and I'm quite sure, so I speak on behalf of my Māori colleagues as well, that when we see there is some specific or explicit duty, rather than an assumed silent duty to deal with the tangata whenua, given that a number of our hapu and iwi have this wildlife on their own whenua, they have strong relationships with DOC, and they ebb and flow depending on the political tide or the bureaucratic tide, sir. And I would encourage advocates from the recreational hunting community, the Minister, and members on the other side of the House to bear that in mind. So there is actually going to be a very large debate when this comes back. Largely, sir, as I say, there is the ideological dimension, because we just will not agree, sir, with that element of the supply and agreement equation which enables the government to proceed and sell the assets. But I'm not going to talk about that. We're talking about a different type of asset here, whether or not the wildlife resources that may or may not be better managed through the erection of this committee, and whether or not they themselves turn into assets. That's for the future, sir. But I can say that I look forward, and I'm going to endeavour to inveigle myself onto the Environment Committee. I've no doubt that the Primary Produce Committee, which I'm a proud member of, I've waited 6 years to join that committee, sir, and the level of toil, sir, which exhausts us on that committee. I'm sure it'll be just a walk in the park going on the Environment Committee, and I'm going to seek the permission to be one of the Labour people from time to time that goes onto that committee to ensure that the Māori dimension isn't overlooked, and that people do bear in mind, sir, despite our institutional concerns about the proposed structure, that the members of the recreational hunting community are a strong, credible voice in the broader environmental management challenges which face us in Aotearoa. Kia ora, sir.
Eugenie Sage.
Speaker, I rise to speak on the first reading of the Game Animal Council Bill. The Green Party opposes this bill because of the preeminence that it gives to introduce deer, tahr, chamois and pigs and the management of our public protected lands, and the way that that cuts across the statutory purpose of conservation legislation. The bill creates the Game Animal Council as a statutory authority, and in so doing elevates and gives special status to hunting and problem animals such as deer and tahr. The bill is a big lollipop for United Future, but it's a huge backward step which is poisonous for conservation and particularly our Indigenous plants. Our alpine flora evolved without browsing mammals, and species such as Ranunculus lyle, the Mount Cook buttercup, are very vulnerable to the heavy browsing and trampling of big introduced herbivores such as tahr and chamois. So we believe that our conservation lands should be managed to protect their Indigenous ecosystems and to provide for a range of recreation, not managed as game preserves for hunting, because these game preserves are in direct conflict with the purpose for which conservation lands are managed, and those are to protect our natural Indigenous ecosystems and wildlife and habitats. And so while Mr Dunn may say that this bill does not dilute existing powers in the legislation, it creates a very real tension between the delegated functions of the Game Animal Council and the Department of Conservation. And we've seen how many hunters interested in protecting deer from by-kill through 1080 operations have opposed and raised a lot of public concern about 1080 to protect their hunting interests, and that same tension will be evident with this Game Animal Council. The bill enables the Minister to designate herds of special interest and allows the Game Animal Council, not the Department of Conservation, to manage areas of conservation lands for hunters and recreational hunting. In giving this privileged status to hunters and hunting, we seem to have forgotten the deer menace and the huge financial and resource investment by the Crown over many decades in controlling deer and other pests on Crown land. Deer were declared noxious animals in the 1930s, and it was the Department of Internal Affairs and then the New Zealand Forest Service which employed professional cullers from the 1930s right until the end of the 80s to eradicate deer from New Zealand, because then we understood the ecological impacts of deer browsing. We understood that that could contribute to erosion. We understood that that severely reduced the capacity for forest regeneration. So the Crown funded those professional cullers, which saw nearly 3 million deer culled between the 1930s and the mid-1950s. So it was that effort in professional deer culling and helicopter recovery for venison recovery that dramatically reduced deer numbers in the South Island. It was this House that passed the Wild Animal Control Act in 1977 in recognition of the need to control these harmful species and to regulate the operations of both commercial hunters and recreational hunters if we were to get effective wild animal control. This bill undermines that past commitment and that investment of Crown resource because of the privileged status it gives to hunting. And in our view, the government's conservation priorities are awry. Having cut conservation funding by $54 million, the government is now proposing to allocate $100,000, it says in the regulatory impact statement, to the Game Animal Council, when the Department of Conservation is having to pull back on its work. And how is that $100,000 to be found? Through reprioritisation within Vote Conservation. So it will be robbed from work on our Indigenous species. And a tramper emailed me only yesterday to say how impressed he was by the work of the department in the Hurunui Valley, where staff are working to protect great spotted kiwi. And they and he were worried that those staff would lose their jobs in the next round of restructuring in the department. So government can increase the spending on noxious animals such as tar, but not for our Indigenous species. And as the regulatory impact statement highlights, there is no need for this bill and no need for the Game Animal Council. And I quote from the statement, "There is no information clearly establishing that the current institutional arrangements and the management regime for wild animals requires change to improve participation among different groups with interest in these animals and their effects." End quote. And it goes on to say, I quote, "There is no evidence that current user groups and organisations, for example the Deer Stalkers Association, are deficient in representing their members' interests." End quote. Mr. Speaker, we already have the Conservation Authority and conservation boards which enable people to participate in the management of conservation lands. We have an example of what happens when you get a herd management plan in the tar control plan in the Central Southern Alps. Himalayan tar numbers were reduced to around 3,000 in the early 1980s. Now, with that plan, which emphasises the role of recreational hunters, we have seen tar numbers climb to over 10,000, with huge impacts on the alpine flora of that region, including a number of threatened plants like the Mount Cook buttercup. So this bill, in putting hunting interests first, potentially compromises all of those Indigenous ecosystems. So, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to being on the Select Committee, hearing public submissions. There will be, I think, a strong swell of opposition because of the way the bill cuts across the Conservation Act and the conservation purpose to preserve and protect our Indigenous biota. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Cam Calder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Huge pleasure. Huge pleasure. Well, we've got eager people supporting this bill on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. We are men of the land here. It is a great pleasure to rise and speak on this bill, the Game Animal Council bill. And the contribution from Mr. Robertson was audacious and barefaced in its disregard for reality. I have confirmed with the Honourable Peter Dunn that, in fact, support of the Game Animal Council bill was part of the 2005 Confidence and Supply Agreement with the Labor government. The only difference between the government in 2011 and the government in 2005 is on this side of the House, we as a government honour our promises. We honour our promises, Mr. Speaker, which is no surprise to the people of the country, which is why we were re-elected. This is an excellent bill. I have to declare an interest. From the age of about 8 years old, I've got early memories of getting up before light, hopping into a smelly old rattly truck and driving to the foothills of Mount Egmont / Taranaki, as it then was known, picking up an old single-shot bolt-action V-sighted 22 and heading off into the foothills of partially cleared native bush and pastoral land to get myself a possum. That was my first introduction to hunting, and it was something that has remained with me ever since. Sadly, for circumstances beyond my control, it's not often that I do get out into the bush, but I have had the pleasure with the Speaker and the Chair at the moment in the Joes River. We only saw old spoor there. We didn't see any fresh sign, nor did we see a live animal. But I have had occasion to open my account in the Central North Island Plateau in the last couple of years and get a wild pig down in Fiordland, in Marlborough Sounds a few years prior to that. Now, this is, of course, the species that this bill covers: deer, tar, chamois and wild pig. You can't go into your neighbour's piggery in Pingwin and say, no, this is covered. It's got to be a wild pig. So there are, of course, herds of special significance, as we have heard, the Wapiti. And this is where the Game Animal Council will have a role. The Game Animal Council will have a role to have delegated powers to manage herds of special interest, and we have heard from Mr Dunn, the Honourable Mr Dunn, how this is happening to great effect in Fiordland and the Wapiti Station. And my friend and colleague on the other side of the House, Shane Jones, was concerned about whether Maori would be involved in the Game Animal Council. I can put your mind at rest, sir. And hello, Gary, love to see you, and thank you for all the work you've done on behalf of getting this bill to where it is, and your colleagues around you. And I want to mention Alec McIver as well, past president of the New Zealand Deer Stalkers Association, who has worked. And these interest groups will be on the Game Animal Council: recreational hunters, commercial hunters, meat exporters, deer farmers, safari park owners, Maori hunting interests, conservation are all in the mix. And they will be able to inform the Minister of Conservation and feedback to her. Mr Speaker, this is an excellent bill. I have great pleasure in supporting this bill. Commend it to the House.
Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the New Zealand First Party to speak to this bill, the Game Animal Council bill. New Zealand First opposes this bill. We note, as Mr Robertson did, that this bill has come before the House solely in order to satisfy one part of the government's confidence and supply agreement with the United Future Party. New Zealand First does support responsible hunting. I am myself, in fact, a keen hunter, not so keen nowadays since entering this House, and in fact since the election campaign, which, as members will know, is time-consuming and doesn't allow one to roam the hills with a weapon, which is perhaps not a bad idea. Rather, New Zealand First regards this bill as being quite simply an unnecessary piece of legislation. The general policy statement of the bill's explanatory note states that the primary purpose of establishing such a council is to improve the management of deer, tahr, chamois and wild pig, including the improvement of opportunities to hunt those animals. New Zealand First contends that this bill, as it is constructed, will in fact reduce the opportunities to hunt the aforementioned animals currently enjoyed by many in the New Zealand hunting community, and that it will add unnecessary additional cost and bureaucracy where little to none currently exists. Mr Speaker, New Zealand First believes that the management of the animals listed does not need to be improved, that existing hunting methods and activities permitted and carried out by recreational hunters are working well with regards to preventing the species named from increasing to pest proportions, and that the breeding populations of these animals on conservation lands are stable and easily controllable by present hunting practices. As other speakers have indicated, regulatory bodies already exist and are not problematic. This bill, therefore, attempts to solve a problem which does not exist, and in so doing, it creates an expensive regulatory regime which includes some quite draconian provisions and which carries the potential to restrict the freedom of recreational hunters in New Zealand to continue harvesting food from the bush and at the same time performing a valuable service of pest management to the nation in the manner which they have long enjoyed. The bill, as it comes before the House, is in some ways poorly constructed and self-contradictory. It provides for the Minister of Conservation to appoint members of the proposed council when perhaps a more balanced and effective body could be formed were it to be elected by the hunting community itself. Clause 8, subsection 1 of the bill specifies that the Minister must appoint no fewer than 9 and no more than 11 persons as members of the council. However, subsection 7 then states that the council's powers are not affected by any vacancy in this membership. In addition to this anomaly, Clause 16, subsection 1 provides that the Minister may designate any herd of game animals in a defined location on conservation land to be a herd of special interest. Yet Clause 30 makes an offence for any person to liberate an animal which belongs to the herd of special interest or to allow it to escape, which to my mind, Mr Speaker, begs the question as to where an animal is supposed to be able to escape to if it already lives in the wild. In addition to allowing the Minister to appoint the members of the Council, the bill provides for the Minister to delegate his or her powers to that Council, and further stipulates that the members of the Council will not be personally liable for any act done or omitted, provided that such an act or omission is made in good faith. So we have a proposal for a Council appointed by a Minister, largely on the recommendation of one small section of the hunting community who gave their support to the United Future Party, who may then receive delegated powers from that Minister, giving them a quite unprecedented level of ability and authority to determine rules which will apply to all of that hunting community. With all due respect to Mr Jones, New Zealand First is also concerned by reference in Clause 8, subsection 3, Part 7, which states that the Minister must consider that members of the Council should have knowledge and experience relating to Maori hunting interests. Well, we ask why this quite unnecessary and divisive provision needs to be included, given that all the species of animal listed are ones which have arrived in New Zealand since European colonisation. We see no need whatsoever for this deliberately separatist provision in the bill.
No.
Mr Speaker, New Zealand First notes that Clause 11 provides for the members of the Council to be remunerated for their services at a rate and a kind determined by the Minister without any further form of explanation or reference, which we consider to be unacceptable. Now, perhaps if this were to be paid by the trophy levies, it wouldn't be quite so bad. Otherwise, we consider that all government expenditure does need to be accountable. The bill provides for enforcement officers and honorary enforcement officers to be appointed, provided that the Director-General considers them to be a fit and proper person, but does not specify what qualities or qualifications any such person should possess. New Zealand First does not have any issue with police officers or other warranted officers of the state, such as fisheries officers, being appointed to such roles, but we do hold concerns around statutory powers being awarded to individuals who may not be trained and vetted in the exercise of such powers. We are concerned also that honorary officers may exercise powers of halt and seizure at their discretion where herds of special interest are concerned, and that Clause 31 appears to indicate that the burden of proof is placed upon persons in areas where such herds normally reside to prove that they are not hunting those animals, and that an enforcement officer may presume that any snare, net, trap, firearm, weapon, vessel or vehicle can be declared to be intended for hunting if they believe they have reasonable grounds. All in all, we see this bill as being unnecessary and an intrusion on the rights and freedoms of hunters, poorly constructed and potentially draconian, and contributing to increased costs for the hunting community at no advantage to the nation or indeed to the conservation estate. New Zealand First does not support this bill. However, we accept that the House will pass it to Select Committee, and we look forward to opposing it there. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker. Chris Ockenvold.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a bill that certainly, Mr. Speaker, warrants support. We've heard the previous speaker from New Zealand First saying it's a United Future Agreement bill. Well, I think that sells it a little cheap. The origin, the genesis, goes back quite a long way. Certainly goes back to 2005. I was aware of its discussion. I believe there were 4,000 submissions on it from people, and it certainly is nothing new to the recreational hunting practitioners. Recreational hunters are very special people, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, and I know yourself are reasonably keen on recreational hunting and have some expertise in fishing, I'm told. And that's all well and good and all to the benefit of everybody. I'm a very keen fisherman myself, and the hunting I have done I've thoroughly enjoyed. But for those who are really gripped with it, it is an all-absorbing, very, very important part of their lives. I remember asking one standard West Coast deer hunter, I said, and he's not a man who I think has ever lied, I said, how many deer have you shot in your lifetime? And honestly, he had smoke coming out of his ears with the concentration, and eventually he said, oh, Chris, I don't know, but it's thousands. 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 Not a light-hearted involvement, a thorough commitment to good hunting practices. I can remember when I arrived in New Zealand how I was struck by the relative freedom we all have to go hunting. That is something that is well worth preserving, particularly in comparison with other countries. It is almost, one could say, a birthright. But management of the hunting stock is something that has been engaged in for centuries. Centuries. Gamekeepers weren't a casual luxury. They had a real job to do. Game wardens have a real job to do. Department of Conservation has divided jobs to do in this. The management of the hunting stock by recreational hunters, Mr. Speaker, is something that is not just sensible, it's extremely positive from all points of view. It will be a statutory body, a voice for recreational hunters, giving voice by recreational hunters. They will work hand in hand with the Department of Conservation. They will work hand in hand with other users of the recreational estate. I've been speaking today, Mr. Speaker, with recreational hunters in the West Coast, which must be one of the bastions of good hunting still remaining in New Zealand. And I have heard nothing except thorough support for this bill and its sentiments. Mr. Speaker, I have great pleasure in supporting it. Thank you very much.
Louisa Wall.
Kia ora, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute. I am the spokesperson for sport and recreation, so I will bring a different spin on this bill. So I want to acknowledge the Minister has brought the Game and Animal Council bill to the House, but for all intents and purposes, it's really a private member's bill. But because of the situation he's in, he's managed to negotiate, as part of his confidence in supply agreement, this bill. And Labour is supporting the debate. I think it's really important that the interest groups have an opportunity to have a say. And actually some of those interest groups we've heard the concerns from, particularly from the Green spokesperson. So I want to acknowledge that at this point in the proceedings we are going to take into consideration what the affected parties have to contribute. So when I look at the purpose of this bill, it said the main purpose of this bill is to establish the Animal Game Council, quotes, to improve the management of deer, tahr, chamois and wild pig, including the improvement of opportunities to hunt those animals. So the premise is you need animals to hunt, not the actual hunting process itself. So it's been really interesting for me to look at what research is being done in this area. And so in June 2010, Amelia Woods and Geoffrey Carey produced a research report for Land, Environment and People. It's a Lincoln University study which looked at recreational game hunting. It looked at the motivations, the satisfactions and the participation of those hunters. And the report found that for most hunters, and these are both overseas and New Zealand hunters, that they were motivated to hunt for the following reasons. Because they enjoyed being in or experiencing nature, that they enjoyed the social aspect of time with family or hunting companions, that they were engaging in an exciting activity, and they got solitude, challenge, sport and exercise from hunting. So while getting a kill is a desired outcome from a hunt, not all hunters are primarily motivated by this aspect or this activity. So I think that's really interesting to note, given the evidence about the purpose of this bill. I did want to highlight some of the interest groups, and as Sport and Rec spokesperson, I have to ensure that, for example, hunting, fishing, the fact that for a lot of New Zealanders, enjoying our natural environment is a pursuit that they not only enjoy but the community enjoys. And actually when we look at TV shows like ITM Fishing, these Trade Zone Gone Fishing on TV3, Outdoors with Jeff and Hunting Aotearoa, that actually this issue in this area is something that New Zealanders are really interested in. But they're interested in it within a context, and that context is the beautiful green Aotearoa that we have. When I look at, for example, some of the organisations that this is relevant to, I look at the Fishing Game New Zealand, which is a statutory body, and it was set up under the Conservation Act of 1987 to manage, maintain and enhance sports fishing game birds for present and future generations of anglers and hunters. So when I look at the history of groups that engage in this activity, there's been a dual focus of environmental protection, environmental enhancement, enjoying our environment. So I think that we have to make sure we're not going to compromise that which a lot of entities are deriving pleasure from. And so I just want to highlight that. But it is the underlying theory of us as a nation having an environment that we can enjoy. So we have to keep central to any bill what the unintended consequences may be from introducing species and their impact on the environment. Looking at the whole context of hunting in New Zealand, it's interesting to note that game hunting in New Zealand is primarily governed by two factors. So one is obtaining a hunting licence or permit which is administered by the Department of Conservation. And if using a firearm, it's about obtaining a firearms licence from the New Zealand Police. So the conditions contained in the hunting licence or permit have to be observed, and some of the conditions around that licence or permit is about not just discharging firearms in the vicinity of huts, tracks and camping grounds, not spotlighting on public property, and not hunting 30 minutes after sunset or 30 minutes before sunset. So again, all these rules are about ensuring that there are multiple uses of our environment, and so we have to make sure that those who are there to tramp, to camp, to just enjoy what New Zealand have to offer, they're not going to be adversely affected by this bill. The other thing I'd like to highlight and take the opportunity to highlight is that it's really hard to see how this bill will address the issue of an enforceable or explicit code of practice for hunters. We do have one for game bird hunting, which has a code of practice, but it's going to be really interesting to see how this code of practice will impact on people who aren't unregulated or belong to clubs. I mean, there are a lot of people that I know back in Taupō who hunt because they like to put food on the table. And actually they get the permits from the local iwi groups because they go pig hunting to feed the whānau. So how are we going to make sure that these people are going to also have this code of practice for hunters? So it's something just to highlight. But if the underlying purpose of the bill is in fact to prevent the types of hunting accidents and tragedies, then I don't think the bill is the answer. If the bill seeks to manage the hunting of specific types of game animals, then surely the granting of hunting licences and permits is the starting point for this type of control. But I look forward to the opportunity for interested parties to have a say, which is why we are supporting this to the Select Committee stage, but we have serious reservations about the unintended consequences if this bill proceeds. Thank you.
Jamie Lee Ross.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take just a very short call in favour of this bill and to advocate to the House that this does get support. Mr. Speaker, I understand that this bill has been a long time in the making, and so for the people watching tonight, the people in the gallery, it'll be a very good thing for them to see this bill being passed through its first reading. I also have to say, Mr. Speaker, we should be congratulating the Honourable Peter Dunn for bringing this to the House. I know he's been a passionate advocate for the game animal community, and having this bill going through in his name, he'll be very pleased with it. And so what if it came through as a result of a confidence and supply agreement? We're a government that gets things done. We're a government that's about action. We're a government that lives up to its promises, and we're a government that's going to pass this bill through its first reading this afternoon. And good on Labor for supporting it. It's good that they are going to support it, but if the only opposition they can come up with is the fact that Peter Dunn supports the mixed ownership model, then that's a very weak set of opposition that they have. Mr. Speaker, the fact that 4,000 people submitted on this issue through the process says to me that the Game Animal Council enthusiasts are passionate people and want to see this happen. Mr. Speaker, also the fact that the Fiordland Wapiti Foundation has been operating for some time very successfully says to me that this bill will have good implications for the community should it be implemented. And Mr. Speaker, the fact that this is here tonight, going through the process, getting put into place as the Game Animal Council community is looking forward for, they will be very pleased to see this happen. How will this affect my electorate? The Honourable Maurice Williamson says, well, look, there's lots of shooting that takes place in some parts of South Auckland, but I don't think that it's animals, unfortunately. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to this bill being passed tonight through its first reading and getting a lot of support from the House.
Yeah, Gareth Hughes. Is this a split call?
Yep.
Warning bell at 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Kia ora. I'm very happy to take a call on this bill because it's a bad bill, Mr. Speaker. This is legislation at its worst. It's all about special interest. It's all about increasing the cost to the taxpayer. It's all about reducing that clean green brand which brings in $22 billion a year to this country, which this government is prepared to throw out the door, throw down the drain with their drill it, mine it, kill it, cut it, sell it. approach to economic development, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we only have this bill because the member for Oharu, Peter Dunn, has put it in front of him. Mr. Speaker, I stood in the Oharu electorate with the Honourable Minister, and I didn't hear him once. I didn't hear the Minister once tell the people of Oharu, what could be New Zealand's most suburban electorate, that he was going to be the casting vote for the unpopular asset sales. He was going to sell off our state assets, those assets which already belong to our mums and dads and everyday Kiwis. He was going to cut it, sell it, mine it, drill it. But what was he going to give in return? What was he going to bring to Oharu? The Game Animal Council Bill, Mr. Speaker, a special interest for those hunters in New Zealand. Mr. Speaker, what we've seen under this government is special interests flourishing. We see special deals for Warners, special deals for Sky City, special deals for MediaWorks, and now we're seeing special deals for hunters. The sad thing is, Mr. Speaker, I don't think the people of Oharu wanted the Minister to be using his casting vote and only getting this for the 30 pieces of silver the country's getting. Oharu's getting the Game Animal Council Bill. In all seriousness, Mr. Speaker, this is a bad bill. What it does is establish the council to improve the management of deer, tahr, chamois, wild pig, allows these herds of special interest, introduce this game trophy export levy. Now, Mr. Speaker, I agree wholeheartedly with the Riggs Review statement of this bill, which said it quite simply is a solution in search of a problem. But I'd go further. It's actually worse than that. It's a solution that's going to cause further problems. Actually, it's a problem that's going to cause lots of problems. And, Mr. Speaker, I've got a huge list from our spokesperson on this bill. The first big problem is it's going to cut across the Conservation Act. This government's already cutting the DOC budget, reducing their ability to work, reducing the focus of our country on marine protection, which Kiwis love and value. It's going to cut across the Department of Conservation, not for the benefit of all New Zealanders, but for a few special interests. It's going to put those hunters in a privileged position. This new statutory body is going to be subsidised by the taxpayer, more than $100,000. So at a time when fiscal austerity is the watchword, this government is prepared to fork out hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars to support this special interest. And lastly, where is the money coming from? It's not coming from the consolidated account. It's not coming from the overblown, borrowed $19 billion on transport. It's coming from the Department of Conservation. A vote which this government has remorselessly cut despite its impact and benefits to our clean green brand and our economy. $100,000 the vote conservation cannot afford, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the bill tries to redefine these animals, the char and whatever, from noxious pests to herds of special interest. Mr. Speaker, it can't be both. They can't be noxious animal pests as they are at the moment and herds of special interest. It shows the contradiction that this bill will be bringing to our country. And I guess lastly, Mr. Speaker, a big problem with this bill is the new council is going to be advising the Conservation Minister, and the council has advisory functions but also has management functions. This is just like putting the wolf in the hen house, Mr. Speaker, with this bill. So, in summary, Mr. Speaker, it's a bad bill. The Greens are going to be opposing it. We think there's going to be a ton of Select Committee submissions opposing this bill, this problem, which is simply going to cause problems, Mr. Speaker. And I guess to sum up, this is our heritage we're talking about. It's our conservation estate. This is a heritage of our forefathers to put aside these wonderful areas. We can't go splitting it up. We can't have separate hunting estates, conservation estates. Next we'll be listening to PPANZ, the oil and minerals lobby, who are advocating for coal, gold, minerals reserves in this country. What's next, Mr. Speaker? This government's going to keep on picking winners, and it's bad for this country, bad for our conservation estate, bad for our economy. Kia ora.
For the second part of the split call, Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, I think this bill's a bit rubbish, actually. But the Labour Party is going to support this bill to a select committee and let people have a say on it. But we have serious concerns, and I have to say we're not guaranteeing supporting it past the select committee process. Let's be clear about what this bill is. This is the price the National Party were willing to pay in order to be able to hock off those SOEs. This is the price. And in fact, it says so under the general policy statement of the bill. It's very clear. It's the very first line of the bill admits that the reason we're even debating it is because that's what they had to give Peter Dunn in order to get him to agree to hocking off the state assets. Hocking off the state assets, even though he told the voters of Ohio before the election that he didn't think selling state assets was a good idea. It says here, right at the very beginning, the general policy statement, the very first sentence, the Game Animal Council Bill delivers on the government's confidence and supply agreement with the United Future Party. This is the price of the asset sales. This is what they were willing to pay in order to get Peter Dunn. I have to say to Peter Dunn, if this was the price, he should have been asking for more. He should have been asking for more, because those state assets that he is going to vote to hock off are worth a heck of a lot more than this piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, there are real concerns with this bill. And in fact, the government are willing to pay the price that Peter Dunn has extracted out of them, despite the fact that the regulatory impact statement, the government's own regulatory impact statement, says that the proposal has the highest regulatory burden. The highest regulatory burden. This from the red tape cutting government. This from the government that was all against red tape. Not a word from the ACT Party on this, who are the great red tape cutters and all about reducing regulation. This bill that has the highest regulatory burden, that the National Party are going to support it because that's the price they had to pay to get Peter Dunn's one vote. Their one vote majority to hock off the state assets, that's what they were willing to pay. What else did the regulatory impact statement? It said this bill is likely to have the highest costs and be the least aligned to the current wild animal control regime and legislative framework. Once again, another indictment in the regulatory impact statement that this national government are willing to put up with in order to get Peter Dunn's one vote. Officials recommend establishing the Game Animal Council as an advisory committee, it says in the regulatory impact statement, but oh no, not for the national government. They don't really care about it, providing they get their one vote from Peter Dunn to pay it to in order to support their asset sales, because this is a government that are barely scraping through with one of the most unpopular changes that we have seen from any government in the last few decades, the hocking off of state assets, which New Zealanders don't agree with, which Peter Dunn told the voters of Ohio before the election he didn't agree with, and now he's voting for it in exchange for them supporting the Game Animal Council Bill. Now, to return to some of the core concerns with the bill, this bill undermines the position of the Department of Conservation, and in fact there are serious and legitimate concerns being raised by people about pest control. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment has raised concerns about the impact this bill could have on pest control, and effectively 1080, huge topic of debate in my electorate, the use of 1080 poison, but it works. And it has worked, and yet this Game Animal Council being established by this bill could seriously curtail the use of 1080, which has had a fantastic impact. Now, yes, it's a point of huge debate. There are people in my electorate that are passionately opposed to the use of 1080, and they come along to all the Meet the Candidates meetings before an election and they tell me that they are. But it has worked, and we have bird life back in the hills around the Hutt Valley that were missing for quite some time, and largely because of the use of 1080. So why should the Game Animal Council have the ability to undermine that? And it's the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, an independent officer of Parliament, who is telling the government this, and they are simply turning a blind eye to that. This bill is not a good bill. It is the price the government were willing to pay to get Peter Dunn to vote for state asset sales, despite telling the people that voted for him before the last election that he would not do so. This bill is misnamed. This bill is misnamed. In fact, it's all about defending one endangered species. But Peter Dunn, endangered species, is what this bill is all about, protecting, and forget about anything else. It's about protecting the endangered species that is Peter Dunn. And I say to the House that come the next election, when Peter Dunn's judged, he will be removed.
A point of order.
Previous Speaker, Mr Speaker, refused to allow, member here, Todd Clay, referred to Grant Roberts as pointing out that he wasn't an endangered species, so...
Well, just a point of order, but I think the comment made by Todd McClay was made in an entirely different context. But the member's time has expired. Thank you. There is one call remaining. Paul Goldsmith.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I think listening to the speeches on the other side of the House has confirmed to me why both those parties have struggled to get much support in provincial and rural New Zealand, because they're out of touch with the concerns and interests of those people. It's fair to say there is not much in the way of game animals in Epsom, but there are plenty of pigs. There are plenty of pigs to be found in the Waitakas.
Look, if members want to have a debate, they can go out into the lobby. This cross-chat is not helpful to the occasion. Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, I'm delighted to support this bill to go to the Select Committee for consideration. I think it's a worthwhile bill. There is room for everybody in the conservation estate in New Zealand and a wide range of interests, and this makes good sense that we can allow people who are interested in hunting game to get out there and have some say and involvement in the organisation of this thing. So, look, I won't trespass on the time of the House, but I do support this bill. Thank you very much.
The debate has now concluded, so the question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. Ayes have it. Party vote. The clerk will conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party.
14 votes opposed.
New Zealand First.
I think it's about.
Māori Party.
Votes in favour.
Mana. Act New Zealand. United Future.
In favour.
A point of order, Michael Woodhouse.
I seek leave to cast a vote on behalf of the ACT Party.
Was the ACT Party not called?
It was, and I'm afraid I missed it.
Leave is sought for that purpose. Is there anyone opposed to that course of action? Look, let's just clarify this. We've gone past the call for ACT. The member's asking for that to be noted. Leave is sought for that purpose. Is there anyone opposed to that? Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker. As I am aware, the standing orders require that any member can correct a vote during that vote being undertaken. It's like they only need to have leave to do so if the vote has been read out.
I'll accept the member and I'll instruct the clerk to record the vote. So ACT is now recorded.
One vote in favour.
And the ayes are 97, the noes are 23. The motion is agreed to.
Game Animal Council Bill, first reading.
So the question now is that the Game Animal Council be considered by the Local Government and Environment Committee. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Party vote. The clerk will conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
34 votes in favour.
Green Party.
14 votes opposed.
New Zealand First.
Votes opposed.
Māori Party.
2 votes in favour.
Mana.
1 vote opposed.
ACT New Zealand.
1 vote in favour.
United Future.
1 vote in favour.
The ayes are 97, the noes are 23. The motion is agreed to. Call on Government Order of the Day number 6.